Mexican photographer Lola Alvarez Bravo once said, "I don't have any major artistic aspirations, but if my photographs serve any purpose, they'll be a chronicle of my country, time, people. They'll tell the story of how Mexico has changed. My images include things that you don't see in Mexico anymore. I was lucky to encounter and capture these images. One day they might serve as a testimony of the time that has gone by and the transformation it's brought." But as a woman who has avowed herself of any artistic aspirations, she has made really a profound and irreversible contribution to the field of photography generally, but very particularly photography in Mexico. So Lola Alvarez was born in 1907, and very shortly after her birth, her family moved her to Mexico City. And at a young age, she was orphaned. And by the time she was in her early 20s, she met and married Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who was her husband for many, many years before they ultimately got divorced. And he taught her how to be a professional photographer. She worked as his assistant for many years. The two of them were very deeply entrenched in the Mexican art world with figures like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, amongst others. And eventually they got divorced, but she took the skills that he had taught her and used them to build a career for herself as a professional photographer. So Lola Alvarez Bravo is considered by most people to be the first professional female photographer working in Mexico. And so not only was she in a studio taking photos of people, which was already a radical act for the time, but even more radical, she was going out into the streets with her camera and taking pictures of the world around her. She originally became prominent by taking portraits of politicians and celebrities in Mexico, and ultimately worked at a magazine as a photographer for many years, but also contributed greatly to the field of documentary photography. And she would go out and capture day-to-day life that she saw unfolding around her in Mexico. And these photographs have become really quite famous. They're in collections all over the world, and have formed a foundation of what has become a large field of documentary photography. And something that she says about these photographs is that they allowed her to capture the life that she has found before her. And that if her photographs have any value, in her words, it is because they show a Mexico that no longer exists. And so I think this is a great opportunity to talk more generally about photography and the claims that are generally associated with it. When we think about photography, it's a medium that we're all intimately familiar with. We have cameras on our phones, we take hundreds of pictures, sometimes even a day. At a moment's notice, you can whip out a camera and produce an image. And there's a sense that a camera functions in the same way that our eye does and captures something that exists in reality in front of us and has a claim of truth to it. And this is really one of the foundations of documentary photography. But at its core, photography, like all other art forms, is highly subjective and deeply curated and framed in such a way that it doesn't necessarily provide the truth that it claims to provide. So while she was saying that she's trying to show us a Mexico that no longer exists, in many ways she's showing us a society and images of people that have never existed. In her own capturing of this world through a photographic medium, she's creating a new world that we can reflect upon and rewrite history through. So she would go into streets and, for example, was at a funeral and that was full of other photographers, and she frames the image in such a way that captures only the people engaging in the actual activity, which shows an accurate representation of what these people were doing when they were at this funeral, but doesn't show us the whole picture, the fact that this was a large spectacle and that there were other people there trying to capture the same moment. And so in this way, we have a very curated sense of what reality is and what reality looks like. So Lola Alvarez Bravo is often deeply associated with the Surrealist movement. We've spoken about Surrealism a bit before when we talked about Giacometti. And one of the foundations of Surrealism is the idea that it's an unfiltered expression of subconscious thought through artistic media. And so you are just taking in what comes into your mind and putting it out into the world to receive. And so she's showing us not the world necessarily as it is, but the world as she sees it and is processing it and is presenting it to us. So today I want to talk in particular about a portrait she did of her dear friend Frida Kahlo. And so we're looking at that portrait here. And Kahlo was also a member of the Surrealist movement. And she once said, "I never painted dreams," which is something that a lot of the Surrealists try to depict. "I never painted dreams, I painted my own reality." And this gets back to that same idea of photography as a constructed reality. The way that we're taking an image of something that is rooted in the real world, but is transformed through artistic vision and creativity. So Frida Kahlo is famous for her beauty and also for her tumultuous personal life. She was in a tragic accident that left her body largely incapacitated for most of her life, and she died in her 40s of complications related to this accident. And so her daily life is full of pain and struggle. And that's something that she tries to express along with her political ideology in her own self-portraits, which are what she has really become famous for. But when her good friend Lola is trying to show us what Frida Kahlo looked like, she's not so much concerned with Kahlo's representation of herself, but rather with Lola Alvarez Bravo's conception of how she wants us to see her friend Frida Kahlo. And so when she's talking about her portraits, portraiture photography, she says that when doing portraits, one has to really discover the person behind the image, being aware of their manners and attitude, discover who they are and what they are like. And so part of this underlying philosophy is that in order to create a representative image of someone, you have to know them on a deeply intimate level. And that was certainly the case for Frida and Lola. They had a very deep and intimate friendship and knew each other in a very intense way, to the point that Frida Kahlo actually took one of the portraits that Lola Alvarez Bravo took of her and put it on the cover of her personal diary. So now let's turn for a minute and look at this portrait. So this was done in 1944. It's called Frida Deep in Thought. And so we have here what we're initially encountered with is a picture of Frida Kahlo, her head in her hand, grasping her arm in her other hand, with an expression on her face that is indicative of deep thought. But when we look a little closer, we're seeing not just a picture that is posed and taken, but we're seeing a layered exploration of the personality of Frida Kahlo. And so this image wasn't staged and posed in that Bravo had Kahlo sit like this, but they were spending time together and Frida was free to move as she felt necessary. And Bravo was waiting for the precise moment when she would capture what she felt was the essence of Frida. So we have here a duality of Kahlo that Bravo is trying to show us. So we have the deeply contemplative thinker, political activist, and artist, Frida Kahlo, whose eyes are looking down. She refuses to make eye contact with the viewer. She's engaging her own senses, thinking out ideas in her head. We have a sense of seriousness and sadness on her face. Her lips are slightly turned down, her gaze is downwards in a almost despondent sort of way. And she's resting her head in her hand as if in exhaustion. And that exhaustion is both mental and physical. She is constantly struggling with her body to be able to physically do all of the things that she would like. And it's a constant tension between mind and body, and which will win out. And if we look closely at her arm, and her hand grasping her arm, it's not that her hand is resting on her arm, but we see these shadows of an indentation that she's squeezing and holding onto her arm. In a sense, holding her body together, keeping herself contained in this small space of the photograph, and also in many ways dealing with the pain that her body inflicts upon her. So we have this contemplative look on her face, we have the struggle with her own body, and then we have this setting that she's put in. And if we think back to how we started this conversation, photography is a lot about framing and what we include and exclude from the picture frame. So all that we have in this picture is the white wall background, this dark door, and some sort of light fixture at the top over here. And so we have a few things that this brings out for us. One is that there's nothing to distract us from Kahlo here. We are just here watching her exist in her own mental space. But then the lack of context also provides us a way of entering into her own interiority. We can project whatever we want onto this space because there's nothing else here. And in that way, it's like we're watching Frida in her own mind. And her own mind and body, in that sense, are a difficult place to be. There's only one door, and we don't have the whole door included in the picture, and the door is closed. So in a sense, there's no way out. If we were to draw an axis down here, we have the door that our eye follows this line down. It matches right with the edge of her eye over here. It brings focus and attention to our subject. And then in opposition, we have this light here that almost looks like a light bulb lighting up over her head, like she had a good idea. And it gives us a sense of relief of being in this mental state, that even though to a certain degree she and we are trapped here, there is production happening. This is a place where there are exciting new ideas coming to the fore and where we would want to be. So it's balancing the sense of struggle and pain and what is produced through that struggle and through that pain. And even when we're trapped in moments, we have spots of light and moments where we're able to recognize the exciting things that are happening around us. The last thing I want to say about this photograph is just pointing out another way in which the world of the photograph is constructed. So at this time, color photography was readily available, but Bravo chose to work in black and white because she wanted to focus on the way that light is functioning in the painting, in the photo, and the way that light evokes a sense of movement and motion. And so when we look at the way that the light is casting onto Kahlo's face over here, it also shows us the shadows in her hand. It gives us a sense that they can move away and reveal more of her at any moment. And it creates spaces that are unclear to us and things that we're not able to access. So as we get down into the corners over here, we're no longer able to tell really what her clothing looks like, the details of her body. The only thing that we really have access to, because this picture is rendered in black and white and because of the way it is cropped off, is an obstructed view of her face and her arms. So we have her mind and the strength of her body without the objectification of her body that we would have if this were a full-length color photograph exposing every detail of her physical form, which is something that Lola Alvarez Bravo is conscious of in constructing this image of her friend, that she wants to be truthful and indicative of what this person's actually like, but at the same time being, in a sense, reverent and respectful. And so even when she takes pictures of Kahlo in a wheelchair or lying in bed, there's always a sense of dignity, which is that she treats her subjects not as objects, but as something that she's looking to deeply understand, engage, and know, in a way that avoids objectification. It's a collaborative process between the artist and the subject, as opposed to the artist claiming ownership over the subject. And part of that is deeply entrenched in her photographic process. She's not sitting and posing people. She's waiting for them to present themselves to her and then capturing them at that very moment.